Hello dear colleagues and welcome to the Didactic Laboratory. My name is Fekem and this channel is for us who are interested in pedagogical research, every kind of question related to school and the teacher vocation, and today we're going to build upon the previous few videos where we talked about planning and making your lesson design, and today we will be discussing Bloom's taxonomy and the solo taxonomy to make your planning even better, and especially helping you as a teacher to convey your intended learning outcomes to your students, and for students to understand what they're supposed to learn and how they're supposed to show it. Welcome. In the last few videos, I've spoken about how I plan my lessons and my units, usually what I call modules, where I discussed that what I do usually is I have a sort of backwards approach to it, meaning that I look at the entire year, I count the amount of lessons that I have, and then I split them into chunks. Then I have a look at the course itself, what I'm supposed to teach my students, and then I spread them out over time. Creates this sort of annual wheel where I have these modules that I can swap around depending on what the student and the class needs. Then after that, I've talked a bit about how I distribute these in units or these modules of 12, where I've used examples from my own classes. But today we're going to talk a bit about exactly how that planning experience can become smoother and how we can improve upon it. Because planning can sometimes be a slightly messy endeavor. You're supposed to tell your students exactly what they're supposed to do, but sometimes that doesn't come across as planned. For example, when I began teaching, I sometimes told my students I wanted them to analyze when they wrote an essay, but they got slightly confused, honestly. They didn't really know what analysis meant. And to be honest, I wasn't exactly sure either. It took me some time getting used to teaching and really going deeper into pedagogical research to sort of understand exactly what we meant by that. And that's exactly where we are heading today, deeper into how we can approach these ideas and how we can use what's called a taxonomy to help us improve our lesson plan. Because sometimes we also have additional things we do during lesson time that doesn't necessarily help the students reach that goal, this sort of fluff for additional content. And when we look at the taxonomy that we have in front of us in just a few minutes, it will help us to sort of clarify how we can use our lessons more effectively, how we can help students understand their progress, but also making sure that, as we've talked about previously, we can improve alignment, meaning the connection between what you want your students to learn, what they do during lesson time, and then how you then make sure that the assessment actually helps to measure the intended learning outcome. Initially, the taxonomy that was presented by Bloom in 1956 was structures like this sort of triangle that you can see here in the left image. And when Bloom and other researchers proposed that they wanted to use this sort of taxonomy, they aimed specifically at looking at action verbs. Now, this means that when students learn something, we want to clarify the intended action that they're supposed to engage in. And the triangle is then meant to help us understand that we begin at the base where we have simple knowledge, and then we have comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and then evaluation at the end, where there's a sort of increased cognitive load as we approach the higher than levels of learning. Where, for example, then knowledge or comprehension could be simple things as understanding, but on the other hand, using that knowledge would then need something different from the student in the long run. And as time carried on, we have another example here on the right called the solo taxonomy, which was presented in 1982. You can see that we have the sort of same idea here with a progressive step working from the pre-structural, meaning that students don't really understand the concept at hand and they miss the point, when we then carry on to the unistructural, multi-structural, relational, or extended abstract. Now, this not only describes the intended difficulties when it comes to learning and what students are supposed to do. But you can also see at the bottom of the image, it says the quantitative phase and the qualitative phase. What this means is that it also helps us as teachers to understand the quality of the work, or where the students are supposed to be heading with their learning. Initially, mainly it's all about the amount of information being stacked and to retain as a student. It can be to, for example, to identify something, or to list, or to combine certain ideas. And these are just matching them on a qualitative level. But then as the taxonomy helps us go deeper and it explains the sort of depth of the responses, we approach the higher order thinking. In this case, ideas such as analysis or comparing and contrast, and finally to reflect or to generalize, using those ideas to explain other than more deep areas. But using the method on the right hand, we can see that we have the connection between then the qualitative and the quantitative spaces. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the unistructural and the multi-structural. So students, for example, that describes one item, depending on what you taught them, would have then been on the unistructural level. Whereas as they progress, they might mention several examples. And here's where the shift then comes into the qualitative phases. So not only are students able to discuss several ideas, they can also connect them, see the relationship between them, and then draw parallels or comparing and contrasting and so on. So not only does it help us to, both of these models then, not only do they help us to understand what students are supposed to do, but we can also see that with time and with depth, we also desire to see these connections as well, since that shows us the higher order of thinking. To give you a bit of an idea how I use this, I've previously in a few videos show you how I generally structure these modules that I have, and I've taken one of my more recent ones and simplified it slightly. So now here you can see an image that represents the 12 lessons where my students in English, they engage in understanding how we can analyze fiction and non-fiction using the idea of the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey is a sort of structure or pattern that we can sometimes use to understand some stories when it comes to character development and certain events or stages in a narrative. And in this case, we can see that to begin with, I want to teach my students to identify the hero's journey, right? So that's the sort of initial steps that I take when I lecture and when I help them engage in activities. But I also want them to be able to structure an essay externally and internally, meaning that we have an introduction, a body, a conclusion, and then these sort of linking words in between. So those are the initial ideas. And you can see then that the arrows that branch out from this first part when it comes to other lessons, I've then made exercises that build upon the taxonomies. And we can see that students are, for example, they're meant to be able to list stages and characters. They're supposed to be able to compare fiction and non-fiction using the hero's journey, that is, or to explain what's characteristic of it, to sort of address these the intended learning goal from multiple perspectives, and to help my students grow successively over time, going deeper and gaining more quality in their explanations. And then we can see at the bottom there's another arrow branching out where it says we want to apply these ideas to their lives. I want them to plan when they're able to compare these ideas with the movie The Matrix. So we watch The Matrix together. And also I want them to argue what parts are a perfect fit. So between the hero's journey and The Matrix. And we try to practice this in writing. So we use these ideas of structuring an essay, because at the very end, you see at the bottom right here where the arrow sort of connects back to the beginning, the final assessment task is that I want my students to identify the hero's journey in structured writing. So they're writing an essay at the end. And since that's the final step, I want to make sure that all of my activities along the way align with the assessment task, to make sure that the ideas that I've taught them align with the task, but also that the activities that we have along the way make sure that my students are well prepared for the task itself. Now, there are some cultural ideas that I want to discuss with you and some cultural considerations, because I teach in Sweden and I understand that some of you might be watching from other countries. And lately, the Bloom's taxonomy isn't specifically mentioned when speaking about Swedish teaching. However, if you want to look at how the curriculum works and the changes in the curriculum, we can see that mainly over time, it's been focusing on analysis. So we can see on the image here on the right then that there's this arrow focusing on analysis, which is then on the relational level, and it's on the qualitative phase of the solo taxonomy. But lately, what we've seen when it comes to the discourse here in Sweden, specifically, that the new curriculum that has been made and developed has had a shift and a movement to the unistructural and the multi-structural levels. And this has specifically been in a relationship to facts and to memorizing core knowledges and to sort of reprioritizing, remembering what students are meant to be doing. And I'm not exactly sure why this is, and if someone knows, you can gladly share your thoughts. But from my perspective as a teacher, when I studied at the teacher training program, I felt that we were taught that students were meant to engage in this sort of inquiry-based learning. Students are given a topic and then they're supposed to explore it by themselves. For example, online, we could say something like, okay, you're supposed to learn about the hero's journey. Google it. Whereas lately, especially if we look at pedagogical research, there is more that tells us that teacher-centered approaches like direct instruction is better to help students develop and to learn. Now, this doesn't mean that eventually we can reach the analysis stage, but what people have experienced from a teacher perspective is that students aren't necessarily mature at that point to reach the analysis step immediately. We need to build the foundation first, and then we can analyze. And I think that's where really the taxonomies have helped me to understand how I can get my students to really grasp a subject and a topic, because I feel that I can make sure that the activities that I create using the action verbs and looking at the solo taxonomy sort of steps, that I begin at the base, I make sure that I have the fundamentals by identifying, listing, comparing, describing, and so on. And then we can move on to analysis and application and reflection and so on. And I do think that really has helped me as a teacher to improve the quality of my education and my teaching. And I hope that others as well who watch this video might have experienced the same thing. And if you have, you can gladly share your thoughts and your experiences. I would love to hear what you think about that. But all in all, I do believe that the taxonomies, they're not necessarily 100% match in the way that the curriculum works here, but they have helped me to improve my craft as a teacher. So to summarize, in this video we have talked a bit about solo taxonomy and Bloom's taxonomy. We began by connecting it back to the idea of intended learning outcomes and constructive alignment. And then I talked a bit about the difference between Bloom's taxonomy's action verbs and the solo taxonomy with the quantitative phase and the qualitative phases, and how these sort of helps us understand the depth of responses and connection between ideas when students share their thoughts and what they've learned. And then finally, I talked a bit about how I apply this in my teaching with an example from my English classes, and also some contextual considerations from being a teacher in Sweden. So thank you all for watching this video. If you found this interesting, please consider giving it a thumbs up to notify me that you enjoyed it, or leave a friendly comment in the comment section below. If you think that there are other colleagues who might find this interesting, please consider sharing the video with them. It really helps to spread the word about my channel, and consider subscribing. It helps feed the algorithm and make sure that the Didactic Laboratory might show up in other people's feeds. That would mean a lot to me. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You can message me here on YouTube. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, and other places. And if you want to have a look at my lessons, you can find all of them at feke.online, where all of my lesson plans and all of my classes are available. Thank you once again for watching, and have a nice day.